I'd like to thank everyone who's taken the time to join this call on behalf of the NetScout team. The idea for this webinar had stemmed not only from the questions we've received while attending the last few technology conferences in Canada, but also due to the barrage of cyber attacks we have all been witness to. It seems like every week we learn of another breach, another cyber attack, another organization falling to ransomware. Due to our position in the technology industry, we believe it's our responsibility to shed light on the evolution of these cyber attack vectors. For those that are new to NetScout, we're a data analytics technology company focused on network visibility, security, and service availability. We mitigate operational risk, eliminate blind spots, and ensure the delivery of IT services at the highest possible levels. We are, in fact, the leader and visionary in this market. Now, from the perspective of cybersecurity, our technology is primarily used for reducing the mean time of detection, extensive back-in-time investigation, and, important for today's session, ensuring the availability of networks and services across platforms. Our customers include enterprise, utilities, governments, and the majority of the world's service providers, which enables us to see a little over 50% of the world's internet traffic at any given day and time. Not a light feat. However, this data ingestion capability allows us to produce valuable threat intelligence. And today's session is going to be presented by two gentlemen, Richard Hummel, who's the leader of our E03 team, and I'll be handing the poll off to him shortly. And he'll be followed by Patrick Blais, our principal solutions architect in Canada. So gentlemen, without further ado, and to all attendees, thank you again. Richard, I'd like to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone to this session. So we're going to dig into some stuff with the threat landscape. Next slide, please. And what I really want to highlight here is what my team does, the mission focus of what we do, the different pillars we're kind of responsible for. And when you look at this slide, it really is kind of a left to right story in what we focus on. So 90% probably of what we do here is in this surgical space. How do we accurately and definitively get into this space, such as individual indicators of compromise, elements, and things like that that we can then defend against? And we're doing this a number of different ways. We will pull data from our first-party collection. We'll use third-party collections. We'll curate the data. We'll go through and we'll look at, is there any algorithms? Is there machine learning? Is there different things that we can do to push those into the feed? And most of what we focus on here is the DDoS space. When we talk about threat defense and adjacencies, we'll cover a little bit of those, but we don't really do much in the malware space. As much as we might have some coverage there, most of what we're focusing on is DDoS here. And that's really important to kind of level set what we're going to talk about today. And then we have this discovery aspect, discovering new threats, what adversaries are doing, the trends, the different vectors, new methodologies that they employ. We take all of that operational intelligence and we push that into our global analysis and reporting. And so this is typically what we do in these webinars, these different sessions, whether it's our threat report, our blogs, different conferences, keynotes at various different engagements. We want to bring this information to light. And so you're going to see throughout this presentation that that's exactly what we're doing. We're showing you what the adversary is doing. We're giving you an in-depth view of that. I do have some specifics to what we're seeing in Canada as well. And so we'll dig in those. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I want to highlight here is just the investment we've made in this space, because you can't really truly appreciate and understand the visibility that Michael just talked about, and then what I'm going to talk about here, until you truly understand how much we're investing here. So when we say most of the world's service providers, we're talking about 500 to 550 internet service providers in the world, 9 out of the top 10 tier 1 service providers. We have many tier 2, tier 3. There's actually more than 1,400 enterprise sites now. So even this is dated, and I only put these slides together about a month ago. So 1,400 enterprise sites. Collectively, we're talking 424 terabits of internet traffic any given second of any given day. We've got 20 people working in threat intelligence. We have more than 2 decades, actually probably closer to 3 decades of building out this network, working with our customers, working with our service providers and enterprises to truly understand the insights that we glean from the global internet space. And this is a every year multi-million-dollar investment. And it's a commitment from the CEO down. So this isn't just my team deciding to go out and go rogue. This is the entire company saying we must have this visibility so that we can bring these trends and highlights to the rest of the world. All right, so let's dig in. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to show you guys is just the total number of DDoS attacks. I'm going to highlight here, this isn't every DDoS attack. These are the things what we would call a host alert. So a customer of ours might say, I have a particular network segment. I have an individual host, maybe a given server. It could be a /24. I'm going to monitor this thing and I'm going to set up host detection. So when traffic exceeds a certain threshold towards that host, now I'm going to trip an alarm. Then I'm going to classify that as low, then medium, then high. When it reaches high, okay, now I'm going to route that for mitigation. You can do that automatically. You could take any one of those low, medium, and high and manually push those over to mitigation if you wanted to. Now, what's really notable here is there's a gap. Service providers are seeing thousands of attacks per day. And when we look at the actual attacks per day, we're talking about close to 50,000 attacks globally per day. These are just like the high severity stuff. So there's no service providers in the world, not even big, huge cloud scrubbing providers that have 15 terabits of mitigation capacity that can handle scrubbing every single one of the DDoS attacks that come through. There's just not enough scale capacity. And if you start to do that, now others are going to suffer. Or you start to scrub everything, and now you're actually eliminating legitimate traffic. Or you're applying flow spec to a bunch of types of different ports protocols, and now you're shutting down traffic for a bunch of people that may or may not be malicious. So you can't do this. You have to, the service providers have to balance this. But what that means is that 75 to 80% of actual attacks out there don't get mitigated by a service provider. They go straight down to the enterprise. So now you have to really think about, well, if all that stuff is going through and I don't have my upstream protection, then I need to have an on-prem solution. Now, on-prem solution is absolutely a must for enterprises. But again, that's not sufficient. What about the big volumetric attacks? Now you have to think about, okay, well, now my service provider, now my cloud provider, or whatever I have as overflow comes into play. So you really need a hybrid approach here. You have to have these two things to really make this work. And that's essentially what we're illustrating here by showing what we're seeing globally. Next slide, please. So let's take a little bit more focused approach on different types of attacks. So the first one here, DNS attacks. Now, when we look at DNS, this is looking at specifically DNS triggers. What I mean by that is DNS query flood, DNS water torture. These are things that are initiating label substitution, non-existent subdomain requests. They'll use various dictionaries to put seemingly legitimate subdomains in there, doing a bunch of requests. You don't have to have high bandwidth, high throughput for these things. These are application layer attacks going after authoritative DNS servers, recursive DNS servers, and this trend is on the rise. Now, if you go to the next slide, you're going to see here, actually that slide illustrates it as well, but on this slide here, you're going to see the actual mitigation. So again, 20% of those things are actually being mitigated. Now, when the service providers mitigate, these are going to be the high bandwidth, high throughput things, they actually do it, and they scrub 100% or more of the actual traffic. So they do a really, really great job mitigating these things. Sometimes they mitigate more because if they're under assault and a lot of their downstreams are being blocked, they might implement something like, you know what, I shouldn't, but I'm going to implement flow spec on DNS. So I'm going to just shut down DNS queries because my DNS server is unresponsive. It's not working anyway. Let me just shut off the flow of traffic so that I can recover, and then I can handle them a little bit more out of band. So sometimes you might see all traffic on UDP source port 53 shut down. That results in a little bit overblocking. This is happening at the service provider level. So how much more is it a problem down at the enterprise level or at data centers or in front of an authoritative DNS server? So having a stateless device in line that's inspecting every packet as opposed to bandwidth throughput thresholds is essential when you're thinking about solving for the DNS problem. Next slide. So now this is the problem, all right? This is going back to January of 2019. DNS query floods. The next slide, you're going to see DNS amplification and destination traffic to TCP port 53. But look at these graphs. I mean, the trend is skyrocketing. and it's only growing worse and worse. Now, this is a 26-year-old problem. 1997 was the first query flood on record. So we're talking about massive impact here to data centers for service providers, authoritative DNS servers, various enterprises that host their own authoritative DNS servers. This is something we have to solve for. Now, there are features we have coming that solve for this, but there's also some practical things you can do non-product oriented, such as make sure you have everything buttoned up with patches. Make sure you're practicing best current practices so that when things come in, you are able to inspect these things. Do some form of DNS zoning. Don't allow external DNS queries via certain paths. Go and look at all of the domains and subdomains that you have that are part of that authoritative server that are regularly queried. Baseline it. Figure out what's legitimate, what's not legitimate. Look at the requests. You get a bunch of queries coming in, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of NX domains being sent out. Well, guess what? Those probably a DNS query flood. So now you can start to inspect on what kind of domains are coming in, which ones are legit, which ones are not, and you can baseline that traffic. So there's a lot of things that you can do looking at the traffic itself. Next slide, please. And here's the next slide. So again, you have DNS amplification, and then you have attacks against TCP port 53. Now that's mostly TCP SYN attacks, and this is on the rise. So a lot of what we're seeing is bots, VPSs, proxy servers that are using TCP SYN floods in order to target DNS related applications. And so they will absolutely use these kinds of attacks. Now these look like DNS over TCP. And so they're very, very difficult to mitigate. But again, these are going to generate a bunch of non-existent subdomain requests when these DNS query floods come in. Now, DNS amplification, for the most part, is on the decrease. However, you can see that in the past couple of months, it's been on the rise. That is almost exclusively in the EMEA region. The reason for that, there's a lot of political hacktivism right now, where a bunch of these different groups are launching attacks against anybody that they can, right? Whether religiously affiliated with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It could be any number of things, possibly the Hamas-Israel thing that's kicking off right now. We're going to start to see more of that. You're going to find that DNS amplification, CLDAP, and NTP, even as much as reflection amplification, is still much lower than the direct path stuff these days. You're going to see those things will periodically come back in force. And the reason for that is these are free for most DDoS for hire services. You can go to any one of these things, and you can just plug an IP address in there and you can hit run. You don't have to log in. You don't have to pay for anything. You can do test attacks. And so a lot of these different groups will use these services, and they'll just flood with DNS amplification and CLDAP amplification. It's some of the most common vectors out there. And so that's why typically you'll see these things come back in waves. And you can kind of see that if you look at this graph, you'll see a wave, a kind of a flattening out, a wave, decrease or flattening out. And that typically happens in the life cycle of some of these reflection amplification vectors. Next slide, please. So here's Canada. So now when I look at Canada and I look at this year alone, you can see that we started to drop off a little bit in the summer months, and then you start to see an increase coming back into the school months. That's fairly typical. What is a little bit atypical for Canada is we don't typically see a whole ton of traffic in the January through April timeframe. What happens is that towards the end of the year, you'll start to see a ramp towards shopping season, Christmas season. And then in the last 2 weeks of December, you typically see the decrease globally. Well, that didn't happen for Canada. It actually had a floated increase over that time period, and that continued really straight through into the early summer months. And then you start to see the taper, which is very much delayed, but now you start to see the ramp period again as school comes back. Now, as we enter into kind of the shopping seasons, you're going to start to see that continue to increase. I would expect that this trend would get up to about where we were in January, February timeframe as far as the number of attacks against Canada. Next slide, please. Now what I wanted to look at is, well, what about the bandwidth throughput? So the next two slides you're going to see is, okay, we're getting attacked. Maybe attacks aren't as high as they were in January, February. What are we seeing in terms of the total bandwidth? And you can see that this is consistently on the rise. Now, if I were to go back to 2019, you would see that it's still consistently on the rise. In fact, this trend line would be much more dramatic because it really has grown over time quite a bit. And you can see here that we have 200 gigabit per second, 150 gigabits per second pretty regularly of attacks. Now, these are fairly large attacks. And I think any one of us here would be very much hesitant to say, oh yeah, 150 gigabits per second of attack traffic, I can handle that. I think most of us would say we don't want that in our networks. And so we want to make sure we solve for those things. Next slide will show you the throughput, if you don't mind. And this one here is pretty much flat. There are a couple of earlier spikes back in the January, February timeframe, notably because there's more attacks. So typically we'll see more of that. But largely this is relatively flat in terms of throughput. But again, you have to solve for an average of probably 10 to 15 million packets per second. And that is a lot of traffic. Maybe it's not the hundreds or the 800 million packets per second, or the recent one that Google just put out about something like 1200 or 1.2 billion packets per second, which is the new HTTP2 stuff. It's not quite those thresholds, sure, but when you look at where adversaries are going, how they've changed, what vectors they're using, what methodology they're using, 10 million requests or 10 million packets per second can be a lot of traffic. So it's really important for us to think about this in terms of here's overarching everything that we have in terms of global visibility, global attack records. Here's specifically what's happening with Canada and various other parts of the world. Now, this is not, I just showed you DNS, but we have carpet bombing attacks. We have HTTPS application layer attacks. We've got proxies being used and abused across a bunch of different spaces. We have cloud resources being used. In fact, a lot of the DNS query floods you're seeing today, I would say about 50% of the ones that I've looked at recently have come from cloud resolvers. So you're going to see a bunch of incoming IP addresses from Google and Microsoft and Akamai and Cloudflare, because what adversaries are doing is they're abusing their free sign-up services, spinning up services, launching the attacks, and then repeating all over again for the next attack. Now, they'll use those things until they get shut down. And these services usually are fairly good at detecting this kind of malicious traffic, but they're abusing it, right? And that's what adversaries do. They will constantly and consistently abuse infrastructure. We have this notion, something we call a DDoS tax here, which is the total burden of responsibility that any organization always will pay in terms of a malicious attack traffic. And I don't have a slide here for this, but if you go to netscout.com/threat report, we introduced some of this, and we're going to have a blog coming probably in the next couple of months that really digs into this. But what we show here is that there is always malicious attack traffic present. And I'm pretty sure for Canada, next week around like the 17th, and I can get this to Patrick and Michael, but the 16th or 17th, I'm hosting a webinar where I'm going to drill into the DDoS attacks. And I'm actually going to illustrate the total amount of ingress, egress of malicious attack traffic for 4 different types of networks, and spend a little bit more time talking about what that impact is. But the reality is that all of us, anybody that pays for internet access, any service provider, any enterprise, we are the ones paying for the adversaries to launch DDoS attacks. They don't care what networks they use. They don't care that they're shutting down portions of networks that they don't even want to impact. They just want to launch the attack regardless of what damage it's going to cause. And so they will wreak mayhem across the world. And that's the notion of DDoS attacks, what we're paying for this. There's plenty more. Again, check out the threat report. I've got one more slide at the end after Patrick goes where I'm going to talk about the different methodologies and things that we're employing and kind of bring this all into a final package for you guys for why we should be focusing on this space and why it's so important. So over to you, Patrick.
So on mute. Can everyone hear me?
We got you.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, Richard. Told Richard they had 20 minutes and you went 20 minutes on the button. Good job. I'll try to respect my time frame as well. Appreciate that. So trying to switch slides here. Just give me a second. There we go. So what do we do about it, right? So that's my sort of section here is what are we going to do about all this stuff? I'll try to summarize a little bit what Richard was talking about without using graphs. So what we want to do here is talk about what's on the decline and what's on the rise. And you can read those for yourselves. But basically attackers, well, they're shifting to non-volumetric attack vectors. So there's an attacker recognition, basically, that reflection or application type attacks are well understood and they're defensible. So we also have human attackers that are adapting their attacks in real time to get around defenses. So the not so unexpected thing that we're seeing is that attackers are performing advanced reconnaissance to understand the target and then design specific attacks. So we're seeing like tailored attack traffic, including application layer. And this really just, all this is just to maximize effectiveness. So in summary, the static DDoS has evolved into dynamic DDoS. So here's some more findings we pulled from our threat intelligence report. So approximately 75% of alerts on ISP networks are not even triggering any type of mitigation. I think we saw that in one of the graphs. Part of that is because 72% of those alerts that are potentially service impacting, those attacks, well, they're 1 gig or less. And that's not triggering anything on the volumetric side. And this is the craziest stat on the page. I had to reduce the font, not because it's not important, but because it didn't actually fit in my little bubble that I was trying to match to everything. But we've seen a large increase in Richard just talked about this DNS water torture attacks. And that's the type of attack, that type of attack basically represents an increase in something north of 350%. Crazy. So let's look at this a little differently, right? So this is a simple network diagram. I like to say like the network basically has one important job. And that's why I made it really that big on this diagram. It's the network's there to connect users to applications and services. That's it. But threat actors, well, they work long and hard. They work long and hard hours to make that job like really hard sometimes, right? So when attackers use volumetric attacks, most enterprises have ISP or cloud protection that effectively mitigates and everyone's happy. But as we discussed, our adversaries are evolving. They're not using traditional volumetric methods as often. And this creates a gap in traditional DDoS protection approaches. So according again to the Netscale threat report, this represents over 70% of attacks that are bypassing volumetric attack protection. The types of attacks that Richard talks about, which we like to refer to sometimes as direct path, but they include things like state exhaustion, which are, an example would be like where you're overwhelming a state table of a stateful device, like your next-gen firewall. We also call, probably heard low and slow, or like application layer attacks, which are, an example could be like a malformed packet and it starts confusing your application. Well, these are all getting through. So the good news is that Netscout has been leading the industry in DDoS protection for years. We were actually ready for this situation. We knew that this type of attack evolution was just a matter of time. We have the only solution that will protect you against the attacks, against these attacks, and the ones, especially the ones that are getting through your defenses. So Netscout offers a complete hybrid model that can even enhance your existing ISP or cloud protection. Essentially, you don't really need to change anything you do today to address that 70%. Netscout's solution includes an on-prem component that will address basically everything that is sneaking by. By adding Netscout to your existing defenses, you'll gain this critical always-on component, and it immediately starts inspecting traffic packet by packet. That's our specialty. And that's before it reaches your existing perimeter defenses so that we can block it immediately. Our unique technology is stateless, which makes it a must-have to protect your stateful devices at the edge against these multi-vector attacks that are coming through. So I always say, you know me, I like to say visibility matters. It does matter. And Netscout helps you gain the proper visibility to address today's threat landscape. So our DDoS technology analyzes the packets that have passed through the first round of inspection. This is important. Don't know of any other solution that uses this type of approach. This adds another layer of defense to further detect any attack that may have evaded countermeasures you put in place by default, or that you did during your traffic profiling exercise that you potentially do at the beginning of your deployment and never do again. The technology then classifies these attacks and even generates alerts to let you know about the newly detected attacks. But also, it's actually going to recommend some tuning protection settings to effectively block those attacks as you go. And then this cycle is basically, it analyzes everything and it basically repeats itself every minute. No other type of DDoS protection approaches this DDoS problem that Richard talked about this way. But I know what you're asking yourself. What does hybrid adaptive DDoS protection actually look like? Or how do I even deploy it? And by the way, I encourage you to keep those questions coming. So please put your other questions in the chat or the WebEx questions, and we'll get to them at the end. So this is a high-level deployment example of Netscout's flagship enterprise DDoS product. It's called Arbor Edge Defense. You also see AED for short. So first, when a threat actor launches a traditional volumetric attack, countermeasures are triggered within your existing ISP or cloud protection. By the way, if you don't have existing volumetric protection, or you're in the process of evaluating, looking for a new one, I do encourage you to consider Netscout's Arbor Cloud to protect you against, this specific attack vector. But as we discussed, most volumetric attacks are handled effectively and mitigated before they ever reach your enterprise. But what happens next? Well, threat actors start realizing that the volumetric attacks are not effective, and they shift to multi-vector. Makes sense? So as we've seen, this includes things like application layer and state exhaustion, direct path. There may also be something malicious that made it through your security stack and it's attempting to phone home using, command and control. We can look for that as well. So according to the latest DDoS threat report, this represents, again, over 70% of attacks today. It can only be mitigated by Arbor Edge Defense, the solution that we're talking about here. We deploy inline. We go in front of your existing firewalls. And then the solution comes with Netscout's market-leading DDoS Atlas intelligence feed, also known as AIF for short. We inspect the traffic packet by packet, and if something triggers, our countermeasures will block it. And our unique technology is stateless. And then again, this is important. This means that we're immune to state exhaustion attacks. In fact, if you put Netscout's stateless technology in front of your existing stateful devices, those could be your next-gen firewalls, things like that, it makes them much more effective. This is why we're having the webinar today. We want to make sure that everyone can understand and make an informed decision when it comes to DDoS protection. Multi-vector attacks are here to stay. Everyone needs to make sure that they have proper protection in place. So here's some more, I'll say, other important components that make up our Arbor Edge Defense solution. So Netscout has a central console that can manage multiple AED instances. This includes on-prem or virtual AED deployments in a cloud like AWS, for example. So there's a super popular AED option that's called managed service. And this means that you have experts, actually I think most of them work on Richard's team, and they're managing the AED deployment for you. This dramatically reduces your time to value. And in, after deployment, actually you have this assert team and they act as an extension to your own security team, especially during those multi-vector attack campaigns that target your enterprise or even just like your enterprise vertical in general. So that's how basically I wanted to give everyone a quick view. I want to make sure that if you have any specific questions or you want to talk to your account managers or SEs, but I'm going to hand it back to Richard here to give us some final thoughts, and then we'll move on to questions.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate that. So what you're seeing on the screen here is the problem. We have all of these adversaries out there. They're all innovating. They're all changing the way they do things. They're changing up their methodology. They've realized this is how people do DDoS defense. These are the products they use. This is how they do inline protection. This is how they do stateless detection and defense. This is how they do redirection, like in the big service providers, rerouting to scrubbing centers. There's all kinds of scenarios here. The adversaries are smart. They're actually really, really good at this, and they will actually monitor their attacks. They will test them. They will do consistent ping values. They will look at TTL values to see when things get rerouted to scrubbing centers. They'll figure out when things are down. They'll do various speed checks to see if the latency is increasing from one location to another. So these guys are very, very good at what they do. Now, there's plenty of script kiddies. There's lots of others out there that are just, they don't really understand what they're doing other than I put a IP address in there and I launch an attack. You have plenty of those. In fact, that's probably the majority of DDoS attacks. But those that are getting better about this, the Killnets, the Anonymous Sudan, DDoS, No Name, these guys are legion strong. There's thousands of them out there now that know this space very well. Now, what all of these have in common, and Patrick did a great job of illustrating the hybrid solution. Not only is it indicative of the changing landscape, but it's imperative that you realize this gap in protection, because all of these, everything that I've listed here, these are the things that will go straight through the service provider down to the enterprise. Because let's face it, there's not a lot of Tor nodes. In fact, they're not generating a lot of traffic. They're designed to obfuscate your infrastructure, which by nature, they're kind of stealthy. Proxies don't generate a ton of traffic. And so there's not even a lot of these things. I think there's like 130,000 of them on average around the entire world that adversaries are using to launch application layer attacks. Botnets, they can generate a lot if you have millions of these things, but most adversaries don't have access to a million bots. Bulletproof hosting. A lot of these things are high profile scanning. Now that can generate a lot of noise, but it's typically not high bandwidth, high throughput. DNS water torture. These are just queries per second, right? How many queries per second can I launch against a DNS server? It doesn't take a lot of these index domains responses to clog up a DNS server. And now it's not serving certain websites. And now users and all of the other individuals trying to browse websites are having issues reloading those websites. Carpet bombing attacks. The very nature of these things are designed to come under bandwidth throughput thresholds. So you have an adversary that says, I no longer want to send a 100 gig attack against one IP address. I want to send a 100 gig attack against 1,000 IP addresses. So now all of those guys are getting 100 megabits of traffic. And that's not going to trip a bandwidth throughput threshold, but it's the same amount of traffic as if they launched a 100 gig attack against one individual host. So you're still having to handle that load. Application layer attacks by nature are typically very small. In fact, most of the application layer attacks against web properties don't even ever get detected by a service provider because their thresholds are set way too high to be able to detect these things. Then you have the adversary doing automation where they're monitoring these things. And so it's no longer a matter of, oh man, I'm hitting this ping request constant. I see this thing change over here. And then 15 minutes later, I'm deploying something new. Or a couple of hours goes by before I realize my attack's not working and then I change it. No, now you actually have a system in place that's doing that in real time. So the moment it starts to be non-effective, something switches. Or they're sending you floods of vectors at a given time and then they're rotating those. Or you take them offline by mitigation, they come right back the very next few seconds. So all of this is things that we on the enterprise side have to worry about. We have to be solving for these things. And to do that, you absolutely have to have the hybrid solution. And so really kind of brings it all home on what you need, why you need it. Now, the cool thing here is a lot of this stuff, and Patrick mentioned it a few times, all of the threat intelligence, all of the landscape visibility, the 424 terabits of insight that we get, we can take all of that, we can identify the adversary infrastructure. So all of these things, right? The proxies, the botnets, the bulletproof hosting, the Tor, the DNS water torture, where they're coming from, what sources they're using. What we have found is that there's a high degree of efficacy and persistency amongst these things. In fact, the list that I push for a botnet in 2 weeks' time will probably have 80% of the same botted nodes in that list 2 weeks from now. In fact, it's even higher than that for reflection amplification. It's even higher than that for some of the application layer stuff in Tor and proxies, because there's not a ton of these out there. So adversaries have to continue to use those and again and again. Now, we can't push every single thing out there. There's like 3 or 4 million bots out there, and there's no product in the world that as far as I'm tracking, can handle 4 million indicators at once. I think even some of the next-gen firewalls can only handle up to like 400,000. Now, EED can handle up to 5 million. Our service provider product can handle up to 2 million. So we can handle a lot because it's stateless. We don't have to reassemble sessions. We don't have to do all that stuff. You don't have to worry about state. And so even the web application firewalls will have a major difficulty in handling these things. I think The last WAF that I look at had that same right around 400,000 limit in terms of elements. Well, if you were to take all of this, like something like 400 million known adversary or known abusable infrastructure out there. Now, adversaries not abusing all 400 million of those. And you were to compare those to that 424 terabits of visibility that we have and look at all of the attacking addresses, we can boil that list down to about 1.2 million. Our products can handle that just fine, but you can't push 1.2 million to your WAF or your other firewalls. They're just not going to handle it. And so what our posture is, use the AED because you put it at the edge and it just works. It just cleans the internet. In fact, we've had some of our customers come to us and say that 80% of their firewall alerts just disappear when you have an AED. And the AED just does it. You just put it in place and it works. There's not really any massaging you have to do. There's not consistent checking you have to do. In fact, I've had another service provider customer that uses AED for their authoritative DNS servers, and he has to constantly remind his guys to, hey, why don't you go check on the AEDs to make sure they're working the way they're supposed to, because they just plug and play in the background silently. And so it's really, really cool to see how effective it is at just cleaning the internet. And with a large focus on DDoS, but even all the adjacent DDoS threats, the inbound brute forcing, the different exploitation, telnet, SSH, SMB, all these things, we just scrub them at the edge. And so it's really, really an effective solution at solving for how the adversary is adapting and their methods. So back over to you, Patrick and Michael.
Thanks, Richard. Good summary, actually. So, all right, a couple of plugs, and then we'll get to questions. And I don't see the questions because I'm in full screen mode, unfortunately. So maybe Domenico or Michael, you can handle that. So what I want to talk about real quick, though, is I put some QR codes up here, created these to make it easy to find that on our website. Richard's team puts out the NetScout DDoS Threat Intelligence Report twice a year. One of them just came out. And I encourage you strongly, if you haven't read it, go read it. It's really well.
Richard, maybe on DDoS outbound, give an example or two.
Are we talking from a service provider perspective or enterprise?
Enterprise.
So, I mean, enterprise doesn't have a huge issue with outbound DDoS. I will say that right now. From my experience, a lot of times enterprises are very effective at cleaning off compromised nodes or IoT bots or various things in their networks. They're typically not the types of organizations that are going to have reflectors amplifiers, because most of those are like home routers or various other things sitting on service provider networks. So outbound DDoS is typically not a huge issue. One of the things that AED can solve for, though, is outbound command and control, or if there's anything in your environment that might be compromised contributing to this space. And so just, to level set on that, now, if you are a large enterprise and you function similar to an ISP, which we have many like gaming companies that function like service providers, they can in fact have some of these devices in their networks. Or if you have a bring your own device policy and you allow your users and your employees to bring in their own laptops, their phones, their IoT devices, connect to, maybe you have remote work. And so you have a lot of users at their homes where their home routers or various other things are part of that. Maybe they're going through VPN, so they're using your resources. So there are instances there, like fringe cases. But by and large, a lot of the outbound stuff is typically service provider networks in terms of like the large scale DDoS stuff.
So the Arbor Edge Defense does block outgoing too, right?
Yeah, it will absolutely do that, mostly from a reputation standpoint. Do we know about the infrastructure? Has it been contributing to attacks? Can we stop those things? The AED is, I mean, it's very, very effective. And again, there's not a lot of outbound DDoS attacks. And so I don't think it's like one of these huge things that we've made all these crazy features and enhancements for the AED. And I'm not actually a product engineer myself, so most of my perspective comes from the intelligence aspect. There may be specific countermeasures for the outbound DDoS that maybe I'm not tracking. So that'd be something you'd want to go back to the product engineers about.
Okay. Just one thing before we move on. So just to get this in before the end, before I forget, basically. So one of the experiences that we offer at our we just had our user summit in Orlando called Engage every year, is called War Games. It is very popular event that we do, and we're going to take that on the road. And I want to make sure everyone in here is aware of that. And we're going to be in Atlantic, Canada in November, and the Montreal date's TBD at the moment. But it's basically a red team, blue team. You get to act as an attacker, you get to act as a defender multiple times. We have people in the room to help you out. You get to understand how to defend against these new attack vectors. And it's a really cool experience. It's a game. Somebody wins, always fun. So, you know, talk to your account manager, SCs, all those people, or even just email me if you want, maybe on LinkedIn, and ask me about war games. We'll let you know when we're having them in your area. Are there any other questions in the chat, Domenico?
No, I don't see any.
Okay. I did get one directly. So I got, maybe Richard, you can handle this one. So I get this a lot, actually get this a lot. So what if my existing volumetric protection, that's not what he says, but their existing cloud protection is always on? Are they protected?
You're still set with whatever that bandwidth throughput threshold is. So let me give you an example. There's a tier 1 service provider that I happen to have access to or have looked at their configurations. I talked about 2 vectors today that are some of the most popular reflection amplification. Why? Because they're free to launch on most DDoS for hire services. That's DNS amplification and sealed up amplification. Okay, so this tier 1 service provider. Now, granted, this isn't a cloud protection provider, but you know, same typical size of a network. For DNS amplification, for high severity alert that would then kick over to auto mitigation, it was 20 gigabits per second of DNS amplified traffic. For CLDAP, it was 40 gigabits per second of amplified CLDAP traffic. Now, when you look at multi-vector attacks, 2 of the most common vectors that show up together for reflection amplification is DNS and CLDAP. So, you know, my response is, can your enterprise handle up to 59 gigabits per second of multi-vector DNS CLDAP amplification traffic? I would wager most of the enterprises out there would say, no way, I can't handle that. So even having your upstream or your upstream service provider or cloud provider trying to detect and mitigate these things, still going to have a solid amount of traffic come through. Now, if you do have like Arbor Cloud, right, which is our cloud solution, they have an entire SOC team, so they can let their thresholds go down much further, but we're still talking in the gigs, right? It's very unlikely that they would have like megabit type thresholds. Something that as an enterprise, you would definitely want to set things at the megabit, because you shouldn't have crazy amounts of traffic from certain ports protocols or certain types of vectors coming into your environment. Whereas with these big, huge providers, even with always on, always in line, they're having to solve for dozens or hundreds of enterprises. And so they still have to have those higher thresholds. So yes, it's helpful, but is it going to fully solve the problem? No, it's not. And we actually had that happen with an enterprise that was getting DNS query floods. They went always on, and they were paying a ridiculous amount of money to be always on, and it still wasn't solving the problem until they put an AD on-prem, and then all of a sudden, a 4-month-long campaign of DNS query floods disappeared. So yeah, it's absolutely essential to have the hybrid solution.
Yeah, that's a good example. I think unless there's any other questions in the audience, I'll just pass it over to Michael Zarukin. I'm not sure I told you I was going to do this, but I'm going to pass it over to Michael Zarukin to close it off, and then call it a day. Go ahead.
Well, thanks, Patrick. To all that have taken the time to join us today, I thank you on behalf of our team. Should you guys have any questions, concerns, or topics that you'd like us to delve down deeper into, please feel free to reach out to us. We're very easily locatable either via LinkedIn or via our contact information, which most of you have. Thanks again for your time. Stay safe out there, and do not be shy to reach out.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.